Hi, and welcome to the Gender Speaker live show on Saturday. I wasn't sure what to talk about today, and so I had a look through the LGBT press, and that gave me quite a lot to talk about. So today, government U-turn on the GRA, that's the Gender Recognition Act review, just the start of some very uncomfortable directions. Yeah, looking through the Pink News and various other LGBT press today, and I'm a bit late starting today because just been a little bit busy, one of those Saturdays, and I think everybody's going nuts because of coronavirus, all desperately trying to get in all of their toilet rolls and bread for the coming lockdown. Oh, God knows what's going to happen on that. But anyway, this government doesn't seem to be getting anything right at the moment. I want to look at the Gender Recognition Act review. I've talked about Gender Recognition Act a couple of weeks ago. But the announcement came out this last week, and a few things have come out, which the actual report. Just want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on there, because it really isn't looking like particularly good news. The woman at the heart of all this is Liz Truss, the Minister for Women and Equalities. Now, we've been quite lucky up until now on Minister for Women and Equalities. When the coalition government came in, it was a Lib Den, Lynn Featherstone, who led the way through most of the coalition and was very good in supporting trans rights, had always been quite good. When Maria Miller came in, I thought, oh, God, she voted against gay marriage and a number of things. But no, one of the first things that she did was to bring up the Gender Recognition Act review. And the start of the process looked at it and said, no, this is actually unfair. Things need, and they came out with a very strong report saying this needs to be looked at in some detail because it's all out of date and really falling well behind what's happening across the rest of the EU. Of course, this was before we decided that we were going to leave the EU. So by 2018, when they did the Gender Recognition Act review, a public consultation, things had started to change, and we've had this undercurrent of right-wing politics taking over in this country in a very uncomfortable way. And that has meant quite clearly that minority groups, equalities, things like that are very much in the opposition side. The government have never been particularly happy with the Equality Act, but in fairness, the Equality Act is not being reviewed. They've made it very, very clear they're not planning to do that. Now, this was just about the Gender Recognition Act, and the only thing really being looked at here was, why was it necessary for a trans person to get two medical referees, one of whom had to be from a gender specialist from a gender identity clinic, to sign and submit a application for a change of gender when having surgery and undergoing medical treatment was not a requirement for getting the gender recognition certificate? That's the big issue. Why are we doing? Why was it necessary to go through that horribly complex and often quite expensive process and very long process in order to do something where it wasn't even required? And that was the big part of it. And when you look at Denmark, at Ireland, at Malta, at Argentina, a whole load of countries around the world have said, "Oh, this is very silly. Let's do it by statutory, by self-identification." Now, I think everybody's got into a really, really big paddy over this self-identification. They think somehow that any man can get up in the morning, and let's face it, all of the debate against this has been about trans women, people who were born male and becoming women. Nobody cares about, to be honest, the anti-trans brigade are not attacking trans men. In fact, they don't consider them men, they consider them women. So they're saying this is our sisters, so they're women, so they're part of our deal anyway. I've seen some trans men, big guys, big beard, I'm not entirely sure they want them in women's spaces, but it will be interesting to see if they ever do get their way, which I suspect they won't. But what they have done is stopped the progress. Because what Liz Truss did last week was to say, that's it, we're not going to do this review. The whole review was that we hadn't seen the review. I'm going to show you a little bit about that now because it has come out. We now have seen part of that consultation. We know the information. We know the details of what went into it. And some of it's not very comfortable when you think about democracy and the way democracy works. Look at this, for example. An organization called Fair Play for Women, which I have to make very clear, has nothing to do with fighting for the rights of women. That isn't on its agenda. Fair Play for Women is purely set up in order to undermine the rights for trans people, and particularly trans women. They're not really interested in trans men again. It's trans women that they're attacking. And I'm not saying this in any way to be awful. Trans men have a really bad time. But this battle is about stopping people who were born male by constantly calling us male, by constantly referring to us by dead names, our past names, by pumping out an agenda of vile that suggests for some reason that every person who was born male is therefore a predator, and even changing gender means all they're trying to do is get into women's spaces in order to attack women. Now, Michael Cashman picked up on this one. Michael Cashman is one of the co-founders of Stonewall and in the House of Lords. And he asked, what evidence of widespread abuse globally, he didn't just mean the UK, does the Secretary of State have for suggesting that men who self-identify as women are doing so in order to find a way to get into safe spaces, safe women's spaces, in order to abuse and attack them? The government refused to answer the question. They don't have any evidence, is the reason. There is no evidence. There is absolutely no evidence anywhere. Now, I'm not saying that you won't find an isolated case of some Looney Tunes. And I'm sorry, there are a few trans people who are absolutely Looney Tunes, just as there are all people who are a bit Looney Tunes and will do silly things. And I've intervened sometimes when I've seen trans people doing stuff which is totally and completely unreasonable and said, no, can't do that. But generally, trans women are people who feel they should have been born women and they want to live as women. And they enter female space. I know somebody tried to stop a trans woman from getting access to a rape crisis centre. Nobody looked at the reasoning behind it. They just said, oh, this is wrong. This is a man going into... No, this was a woman who had changed gender from male to female, had been raped, and needed to access a woman's space because she had been raped, and that was where the support services were to help women who had been raped. Just because someone used to be a man doesn't mean that they're not going to get raped. That doesn't mean they're not going to get abused. And this is something that people aren't understanding. If I need to access women's space, it's because I need access to the services there. Why do I use female toilets? Because, frankly, I am not safe entering male toilets. I'm putting myself at significant risk. Now, then the question is, oh, well, other women are at risk if I... No, women are not at risk. If I go into a female toilet, go into a cubicle, shut the door, do my business, and then wash my hands and leave. That doesn't put other people at any risk at all. And there is to suggest that this message coming out that somehow all trans women are future predators, future rapists. And in fact, they use that terminology. Fair Play for Women, like the LGBT Alliance, which has got nothing to do with support for lesbian, gay, bisexual people. It is totally and completely to stop trans people from accessing spaces, to block them, to actually make them disappear. To be perfectly honest, they would like the whole idea of trans people to be removed. What's interesting looking at that other report is that I'll just show you this. Whoops, come on, talk to me. 12,000 responses to that survey consultation by trans people. Now, it's very difficult to actually identify because they didn't specifically ask questions to identify how many of the people responding were actually trans people. Some of the questions were specifically aimed at trans people, and they did say, because I filled in the consultations myself, this question is only for people who are transgender. Of course, what we found out is that a lot of people who were cisgender, not trans, answered those questions as well, which messes up the validity of the consultation and means that we don't have any accurate figures about how many. But what we're saying is that the number of trans people who answered those questions was 2/3 of the ones from Fair Play for Women. Now, here's the important thing about the Fair Play for Women one. 18,370 responses, and they were all identical. The only difference between each of those 18,000 responses was the name and email address. They were a pro forma template passed out by Fair Play for Women that could not be edited or altered by anyone. The answers were already written by their experts, so all people had to do was just fill in the details. It was a orchestrated campaign to skew the results of the consultation. The trans people who answered in the main were trans people putting forward their views. I'm not going to say all those views were good views. They probably weren't. But in the main, it's trans people saying, look, this is what we want. Because what's also interesting to find out is that in the review, 1.1% of the respondents had applied for a gender recognition certificate. 1.1%. Now, I'm not sure whether that was of the trans people or whatever. It's a tiny, tiny percentage. And yet Truss says the balance struck in this legislation is correct. So what she's saying is that she feels, having looked at the legislation, it's actually a fair and reasonable legislation, doesn't really need to be changed. What they're going to do is to digitize the forms to make it easier to apply. We're going to get rid of the £140 fee and make it a little bit less onerous. And there are 3 new gender identity clinics to help take up the backlog. This is the thing that's been missed. It's taking about 60 months, 5 years, to get to the clinic. Now, you can't start any process until they see you. When I got to the gender clinic, they said you have to basically live in your acquired gender for a period of 2 years before you can have surgery and get hormones a little bit before that. But before you get proper treatment, anything that you really want, you have to be 2 years. I said, well, I've already been 3 years. And I could prove that. I'd actually changed my passport and all the other things. They said, oh, no, it's our 2 years. 2 years from the time we first see you. So it doesn't matter how long a trans woman has actually been in this process of undergoing transition and coming to terms with it and seeing private consultations or whatever and seeing their GP, seeing psychiatrists, because honestly, it affects our mental health, trying to deal with the fact that everything feels all wrong. And you finally get to the clinic, and it took me 10 years to actually get to a clinic because there wasn't one at the time. And by the time you get to that clinic and they say, oh, yeah, no, it's 2 years from now, counting from now. In fact, you have to now come out fully and make sure you're living in full because we won't start it until you're actually out there. And we're not going to give you any help in that. Social transition, you get no help at all. It's just the medical transition. So go away, come out, tell everybody, start working, sort things out with your employer. And once we're clear or comfortable that you're actually out and living in there, we'll start the clock. And in 2 years, you might get to see a doctor. Now, I have a gender recognition certificate. I got mine fairly quickly. Things actually, I think, were a lot easier when I did mine. But all that's happened is we've just put the block on everything. All of the discussion, we've had 5 years discussing and going through this and looking at it with a very positive view coming from the government that, yes, this needed to be reformed. And if we look at it, we'll find the TUC have just come out and said 5.3 million workers, we support the motion They put a motion in support of trans people and in support of the changes to the Gender Recognition Act. The BMA, the British Medical Association, also emphatically supports trans and non-binary people and the need to change the Gender Recognition Act. When you look through all this, it's a bit, it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, doesn't it? That suddenly this one person has said, no, I don't like it. We're not going to, won't answer any questions, isn't going to deal with things. It's fairly clear that she is part of that agenda. The thing that, J.K. Rowling has joined in on this one. And we now know J.K. Rowling has just written a book. And what's happened? Her lead character, her main antagonist is a serial killer who dresses as a woman in order to get and hurt and damage other people. I was reading again today, somebody has read that book and said it literally lives up to all of our negative expectations of what it was going to be. It is a book solely designed to make people feel uncomfortable about trans women as potential murderers, rapists, perpetrators of horrible crimes. It's the way people do to demonize the opposition. I talked some time ago, and we'll be talking in the future, about this whole idea of social identity, this sense of identity. And what we do in social identity is we big up our group. We get into this them and us thing, and we big up our group, and then we demonize the others. And we saw this in the way the Nazis called Jews rats. In Rwanda, the Tutsi were called cockroaches. All of this is a way in which you demonize and dehumanize the opposition and make it as if they are less than nothing, to be trodden upon, to be kicked off your boot as you come through the door. That's the sort of sense that we want people, that they try to get people to feel about and make this negative view. It was done to gay people for years and years and years, and there are even people now saying what they're hearing now is very similar to the kind of anti-gay campaigns that were going on in the 50s and 60s against gay people. And in America, with the whole thing that AIDS is a gay disease. So I haven't quite finished. Guidance for schools on sex education. As you know, September, we're just about getting back to school, but the PHSE education has changed, and in it has come this relationship and sex education, where kids from a very young age now have to learn in school that people don't all come from, nuclear families with a mummy and daddy and kids and the dog and the goldfish. But that some people have got two mummies and two daddies, and that sometimes daddies become mummies and mummies become daddies, and that whole sense of the real rich variety of human existence needs to be portrayed. Instead of creating these mass stereotypes that this is the way it should be, so that anybody who doesn't come from a family like that suddenly starts to feel bad. Kids who came from broken homes were made to feel really. When I grew up, divorce was nowhere near as popular and common as it is now. So if you came from a broken home, you were made to feel pretty bad, and comments were made, books suggested it was bad, and this is danger. I was talking yesterday to Natalie about the way in which picture books can depict very strongly gender stereotyped images about the way life is, and we need to stop that. We need to create images that people see in their day-to-day life which more reflect the reality of life, not to make it negative, but just to say that it's not just that one color. It's actually much more multicolored now. So what has happened? Well, it seems that what's happened now with this is that the government have now shifted again on this, where before the summer or before coronavirus, as we built up the last year when it was being sort of piloted from last September, all of a sudden the guidance is saying you need to avoid dangerous stereotypes. And the dangerous stereotypes that we've been given an example of are, if a child is gender non-conforming, you should not be suggesting to the child in any way that might be because they're transgender, because there's something wrong with their psychology or something wrong with their body. So what we're now saying is no, don't talk about transgenderism. If people are gender non-conforming, because I've seen the comments that have been coming out, most of these kids actually will turn out just to be gay, and that's much better. It's better to be gay than to be trans. Well, let me tell you, when I grew up, basically it was illegal to be gay. But if I'd been able to take action when I was younger, I might have lived a very, very different life. Now, I'm not saying I didn't enjoy my life, but I know some people for whom this life has been absolutely horrendous. They would rather die than face it. And puberty, when they go through puberty and all of a sudden their body starts, changing in ways they can't stop, it's just too much. And I ran a support service for quite a while. The numbers I know for certain that we intervened to prevent at least 4 suicides during that time. We intervened. The numbers of times Jamie was down at Hull Royal, having scooped somebody off the streets at 2:00 in the morning with their wrists slashed, or having taken umpteen paracetamol. The constant number of times we came across young trans kids self-harming, self-abusing, trying to come to terms with this, and in a world where nobody wanted to accept them. And we were the only support they had, the only lifeline that there was. So I know that it's a pretty harsh and pretty hard life for them. And I thought that we were going to start to see a more positive attitude in schools. And all of a sudden, we're seeing yet another U-turn as the government shift and change on this. Now, you may or may not be aware, and I did have a little thing for the screen to put up on this, but I've lost it. There was a employment tribunal hearing beginning of this week, which actually went in favor of non-binary people. So what it said is that somebody who is non-binary is protected under the gender recognition protected characteristic within the Equality Act. So you don't have to be transitioning from male to female or female to male in order to qualify. What the Equality Act says, you have to be planning to undergo, are undergoing, or have undergone a personal process of gender reassignment. Now, gender reassignment was assumed to mean we'll assign female, now assign male. But what the tribunal has said is no. Just not being the gender you were assigned at birth is sufficient. You're moving to somewhere that isn't where you were, and that's okay. Because there was no requirement that anybody ever had to finish that process. You only have to start it in order to qualify for protection under the Equality Act. So anybody who starts just having counselling, starting cross-dressing, dressing in a way that isn't normal for your birth sex, that's enough to basically say you're planning to undergo, are undergoing, have undergone a process of gender reassignment. So that's a good thing. But the interesting thing is the government spent an awful lot of money on lawyers to fight that case and stop it from going through. Whether it will become precedent or not, I don't know. It's an employment tribunal. It is law, but it will probably end up being battled out in one or two other courts before it finally becomes the law. The good thing about our law precedents is once the Supreme Court says this is it, this is the rules, only Parliament can override it. You can still get to the European Court of Human Rights, which we are still part of. But that's nothing to do with the EU, although this government would still like us to be out of that. I worry a little bit about the equalities agenda because it doesn't work for a government that likes to impose its will on people. Because equalities is about real democracy. It's about you and I having the right to go to the government and say, no, we don't like that law, change it. And be able to get to a court, the European Court of Human Rights, and say, and we have a court hearing that says you must change it. That's why the Gender Recognition Act came into place in the first place. So there we go. It's all going to be a challenge for us for the future. I'm not sure. I suspect part of the reason the Gender Recognition Act reform has been dumped is because the government has got so much on its plate with handling this second spike on the coronavirus. I know from my perspective as a speaker, I'm unlikely to see the speaking industry recover much this side of 2022. To be perfectly honest, I'm not expecting to see anything meetings for me to speak at. So we're all going to be online, doing it online, but that's no problem. Speaking of which, I have a trans and non-binary inclusion workshop that I'm running on October the 20th. It's the first one I'm running as a public course. I'm doing them for privately for all clients, but this one's an open course. And I'm not quite sure. I couldn't work out what people could afford to pay in these days because so many of us are struggling with money. So I said, right, I want people to be able to access this information. And it will be about how to make your workplace more trans inclusive, non-binary inclusive. And in fact, it's about inclusion. So it covers more disabled inclusive, more black inclusive. It's about a more inclusive workplace, but with a focus on gender and non-binary in particular, because I want to look at how that fits in. I recommend a minimum £20. I've got to try and live. But, please come along, pay what you can afford. 20th of October. And it's going to be very focused on the workplace. So it really is about how to make a workplace more trans inclusive and understanding what the background behind that is. So join me tomorrow, 4 p.m. Tomorrow, I'm making Sundays my history days. So tomorrow is going to be a little bit more about some trans history again. And in this case, I'm going to look at it's LGBT history I'm looking at. And tomorrow I want to look at the drag queens, drag kings. How did that all happen? How did we end up having drag as one of our main platforms of entertainment for kids and everything? And this goes back for hundreds of years. Drag has been a really, really popular form of entertainment. And I want to look at how that emerged, how that happened, and where we are with drag and who's involved in it. I think people get a little bit confused about what's the difference between drag and trans. And well, let's see if we can try and deconstruct that a little bit and have a bit of fun. So I'm going to be looking a bit at Mae West and Julian Attenge and Bill Savoy and Christopher Biggins. Why not? And the whole sort of pantomime thing. So join me tomorrow for a little look at the history of female and male impersonation on the stage and why that's there with us. For now, hope you have a good day. Hope you have a good evening. Saturday night, pubs are going to be shutting early, but I'm sure you'll find some way to entertain yourself. I'll see you tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Take care.